Hey everyone, John Reardon here with a quick technical look at Hogwarts Legacy running on the Nintendo Switch. Since its announcement for Switch, I've been extremely curious about this one, so I couldn't resist burning the midnight oil to take a look. Hogwarts Legacy feels like a game that first and foremost targeted 9th generation systems like the PlayStation 5 along with the Xbox Series X and S. When I watched my wife play through it on Series X earlier this year, I was extremely impressed by the sheer geometric density on offer. The castle in particular displayed an incredible amount of micro detail, and the overworld didn't disappoint either. A few months later, it was ported quite successfully to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. The Switch version, meanwhile, has taken a little longer, and now that I have it in my hands, I can understand why. Is this a compromised version of the game? Absolutely, it was always going to be. That being said, it is an absolute miracle that this somehow runs on the Switch at all, and manages to be a mostly passable version of the game. So, how are they pulling this off? First off, it's important to understand the world Hogwarts Legacy presents. You could somewhat consider it to be two open worlds sort of crammed into one. Firstly, you have the entirety of Hogwarts itself. The castle consists of a labyrinth of stairwells, hallways, and bridges linking massive chambers. It truly feels one-to-one in terms of scale with the way the castle has always been depicted. This is all presented seamlessly, allowing you to move through it with no loading screens. On its original platforms, this was done by always keeping the adjacent rooms loaded into memory, so you could move from room to room with no pauses. The only times you would sometimes encounter a short wait at a door was when leaving the castle and heading out into the overworld. Secondly, that world outside the castle essentially feels like a second open world, only this one is open and spread out in contrast to the castle's densely packed corridors, and moving between these two worlds on PS5 or Xbox Series systems was completely seamless. Now let's take a look at the Switch version. Impressively, that castle is still richly detailed and seamless. The only difference is that you generally wait for just a moment at each door as it loads the next room. The Switch just doesn't have the memory to store every surrounding room like the PlayStation 5 and Series X. It winds up reminding me a bit of playing Metroid Prime on the GameCube. You move through a room too fast, and you'll need to wait a moment for the next door to open. The bigger change, however, comes when you want to go outside. As you can imagine, if the Switch struggles to hold two rooms in memory at once, holding the entire world outside as well would essentially be impossible. Instead, when exiting the castle on the Switch version, you'll hit up against a loading screen. The same goes for when you head back inside. Essentially, these two maps have been fully disconnected from each other. It seems straightforward enough until we look back at the original version and notice that every time you cross to a different part of the castle, you go outside and see the rest of the world. To adjust for this, all open bridges connecting two sections of the castle have been replaced with enclosed walkways. And I don't just mean they wrapped walls around the existing bridges, they rebuilt these passages from scratch, and each one is completely unique. These two stained glass passages are my favorite, and use assets unique to this version of the game. Is it a compromise? Of course, but the degree of effort that's gone into making the changes feel natural is truly remarkable. Now, there is one section of the castle that couldn't be walled off like this. At the top of the astronomy tower, you're able to look out and see into the overworld, and this is preserved on Switch. A closer look reveals an extremely low-resolution version of the environment in order to present this scene without incurring a loading screen. It's likely a similar technique could have been used on those bridges, but they're really only able to get away with this low-poly version of the world because you're way up in a tower. At ground level, this would look extremely obvious. Now, there is one other section of the world that has made some significant changes, but these I feel are less successful. When visiting Hogsmeade, the largest town in the game, you'll encounter a loading screen as you enter or leave the town. Fair enough, however, once you're in the town, you'll also get a loading screen to enter any building. This is particularly strange, as every other building in the overworld can be explored seamlessly, and none of the buildings in Hogsmeade compare in terms of complexity to the rooms in Hogwarts itself. It makes visiting the town extremely slow, especially since there are no fast travel points within the buildings themselves, so going to a shop generally incurs two loading screens, one to get into town and then one to enter the shop itself. The loading screen between the castle and the overworld I think is perfectly justified, and even Hogsmeade wouldn't be bad if it weren't for those extra loading screens on buildings. I should note that other small villages across the map are completely seamless, including the interiors of their buildings. So, with all that in mind, how does Hogwarts Legacy actually run on Switch? Well, resolution appears to be dynamic. When docked, almost all the scenes I tested came out at 648p. This included both in Hogwarts and out in the world. The lowest resolution I counted docked was 640p, but I suspect this could go lower. I also assume it probably maxes out at 720p. Handheld is much more variable, and I had a harder time getting accurate counts. Suffice it to say that most of the time, I'd say it looks to run between 540p and 480p, though I have seen at least one large scene drop even lower. It's a soft but honestly not unreasonable image, all things considered. What does break up the image somewhat are some post-process bloom effects that look to render at a fraction of the actual render resolution of the scene. These can give the impression of a much lower resolution image in certain situations. As for frame rate, the game targets 30 FPS and honestly spends a lot of time at or very near to it. It certainly isn't locked by any means, but it remains generally playable most of the time. Where the game runs into major trouble is in large encounters in the open world. While fighting this troll and a couple of his minions, I had the game maxing out at 20 frames per second with drops into the mid-teens. You can tell just from watching the gameplay that I was having real trouble with the added input latency. For what it's worth, fights in caves or in the castle or other interior locations generally run much better. Likewise, riding your broom quickly at low altitude can also incur some frame rate hits, but these didn't bother me as much as those in combat. Now, I could spend the rest of my life chronicling all of the tiny differences in this game, especially since I'm still far from actually done with it. But my impression thus far is simultaneously that I think this is a heavily compromised and flawed version of the game, while also being generally impressed that it's running on Switch at all. These developers were given an impossible task to port a game targeting PS5 and Xbox Series systems back to hardware that is more closely on par with the PS3 than it is with the PS4, let alone the PS5. This is a game that combines one of the most geometrically dense and expansive interior environments I've ever seen, with an open world from which you can take off and fly at any moment. The very genuine effort made to rebuild sections of the castle for Switch with brand new assets deserves substantial praise. This to me feels like a port demanded by a producer that had no idea what they were asking, and somehow the devs delivered a functional version of the game. I need to make it clear that if you have other options, I wouldn't recommend this version, but so long as you understand the compromises, I wouldn't warn everyone to stay away either. If, like me, you have a fascination with ports that shouldn't exist but somehow do, Hogwarts Legacy is one to take a look at. So that's all for now, but keep an eye out for more from me on Hogwarts Legacy on Nintendo Switch by subscribing to this channel and checking out NintendoWorldReport.com. You can also follow me on most social platforms at JTSKnight92 if you have any questions about this port or you just want to talk about game tech and Nintendo. Once again, my name's John Rairdon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.